How to automate SMB compliance using Azure Logic Apps. Hi there. Today we'll talk about how to automate SMB compliance using Azure Logic Apps. We'll cover everything you need to know about regulatory compliance automation for SMBs using Azure Logic Apps. So, let's get started. What is Azure Logic Apps and why it matters for SMB compliance? Azure Logic Apps is Microsoft's cloud-based workflow automation service, designed to connect applications, data sources, and services using pre-built connectors and a visual designer. It runs on the Azure platform and supports over 400 connectors, including Microsoft 365, Salesforce, SAP, custom APIs, and on-premise databases. For compliance purposes, this matters because most regulatory requirements are fundamentally process-driven. HIPAA requires documented data access logs. GDPR mandates timely breach notifications. Labor laws require accurate time tracking records. Each of these is a workflow, and workflows can be automated. According to Microsoft's official Azure Logic Apps documentation, the platform supports both stateless and stateful workflows, making it suitable for everything from quick event-driven alerts to long-running compliance processes that span days or weeks. For SMBs already invested in the Microsoft ecosystem, the setup time is minimal and the learning curve is manageable. Azure Logic Apps compliance automation for SMBs is not a stripped-down version of an enterprise tool. It is the same platform that large organizations use, priced on a consumption model that makes it accessible at any scale. The real compliance burden SMBs face outside of fintech. Most content about compliance automation focuses on banks and payment processors. That leaves a much larger group underserved. Healthcare clinics, law firms, HR-heavy retail businesses, and logistics companies all face significant regulatory pressure, often without a dedicated compliance officer or IT team. Common compliance burdens faced by non-banking SMBs include healthcare practices, patient data access logs, HIPAA breach notifications, staff credential tracking, legal firms, client conflict checks, matter file retention policies, bar association reporting requirements, logistics companies, driver certification renewals, vehicle inspection records, customs documentation, retail and HR-heavy businesses, I-9 verification, minimum wage compliance by jurisdiction, overtime record keeping. The National Federation of Independent Business consistently ranks regulatory compliance among the top 3 operational burdens reported by small business owners. The cost shows up in staff hours, not just filing fees. A business spending 10 hours per week on manual compliance work is effectively paying a part-time salary just to stay legal. This is precisely the gap that business process automation for SMBs is designed to close, and Azure Logic Apps is one of the most capable tools available for the job. How regulatory compliance automation for SMBs using Azure Logic Apps works. At its core, regulatory compliance automation for SMBs using Azure Logic Apps follows a trigger action model. Something happens in your business, and Logic Apps responds automatically with the required compliance action. The basic structure of any compliance workflow has 4 parts. Trigger: an event occurs in a connected system, such as a new patient record being created, a contract being signed, or a delivery being logged. Condition: Logic Apps checks whether the event meets specific criteria, including patient category, document type, or employee classification actions. The workflow executes the required compliance steps, sending notifications, creating log entries, generating reports, and archiving records. Output: the completed audit trail is stored in Azure Blob Storage, SharePoint, or a connected database for future review. This pattern applies to virtually any compliance requirement. A healthcare clinic can log every access to a patient record in a format that satisfies HIPAA audit requirements. A logistics SMB can trigger a vehicle inspection reminder 30 days before a certification expires. A law firm can archive a client matter file automatically when the matter status changes to closed. The platform is also expandable. When your compliance needs outgrow simple rule-based workflows, you can integrate Azure AI services to handle document classification or anomaly detection. Our guide on how to build AI agents for SMB automation on Azure explains how to extend these workflows with intelligent automation. Industry use cases: healthcare, legal, and logistics compliance automation. Compliance automation using Azure Logic Apps looks different across industries, but the underlying mechanics are consistent. Here is how it applies in 3 of the most compliance-heavy sectors for SMBs. Healthcare, HIPAA compliance without a dedicated team. A small medical practice with 3 physicians and no IT staff can automate several HIPAA requirements directly in Azure Logic Apps. Access logging. Every time a staff member opens an electronic health record, Logic Apps logs the access timestamp, user ID, and record type to an Azure SQL database breach notification. If an unauthorized access pattern is flagged via Azure Monitor, Logic Apps drafts and sends a breach notification to the required parties within the 60-day HIPAA window. Credential renewals. Staff certifications stored in SharePoint trigger automated reminders at 90, 60, and 30 days before expiration. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services HIPAA portal outlines specific audit and documentation requirements that Azure Logic Apps can address systematically, reducing dependence on manual checklists and individual staff memory. Legal firms, matter file retention and conflict checking. Small law firms face real liability if client files are not retained according to state bar rules or if a conflict of interest goes undetected. With Azure Logic Apps, a firm can trigger automated file archival workflows based on matter close dates stored in a SharePoint list or SQL database. Run new client intake forms against an existing client database to flag potential conflicts before a retainer is signed. Generate monthly reports on open matters past the standard review period. Delivered directly to the managing partner, these workflows run in the background with no manual intervention required after initial setup. Logistics, driver and vehicle certification tracking. Logistics SMBs managing fleets of 5 to 20 vehicles face DOT and state-level certification requirements that are easy to miss with spreadsheet-based tracking. Azure Logic Apps can monitor a SharePoint list or SQL table of certification expiry dates, alert fleet managers automatically, and log every compliance action for audit purposes. For businesses building out broader logistics infrastructure on Azure, the architectural decisions extend well beyond compliance. Our post on logistics app development on Azure, Essential Steps, covers the platform choices that underpin scalable logistics systems. Step by step, building your first Azure Logic Apps compliance workflow. You do not need a developer to build a working compliance workflow. Here is a practical walkthrough using document retention alerts as the example. This is one of the most common starting points for SMBs new to Azure workflow automation. Step 1. Create a Logic App resource in the Azure portal. Search for Logic Apps and create a new consumption plan resource in your preferred Azure region. The consumption plan charges only for what you use, which keeps costs low during testing. Step 2. Choose a recurrence trigger. Set the workflow to run once daily at a time that suits your team. This checks your compliance records every 24 hours without any manual intervention. Step 3. Connect to your data source. Add a Get Items action connected to a SharePoint list containing your compliance documents, their creation dates, and their required retention periods. If you use a SQL database instead, the Execute a SQL Query action works equally well. Step 4. Add a condition. Use the built-in condition control to check whether any document's retention deadline falls within the next 30 days. Logic Apps evaluates this against each row returned from your data source. Step 5. Define your response actions. If the condition is true, add 2 actions. Send an email, V2, action via the Outlook connector to notify the responsible team member, and a Create Item action to log the alert in a compliance audit SharePoint list. Step 6. Test and monitor. Run the workflow manually from the Logic Apps Designer. Review the Run History panel to confirm it executed correctly, and set up Azure Monitor alerts for any workflow failures going forward. Most SMBs can complete this setup in 2 to 3 hours. For more advanced implementations involving AI-based document analysis or intelligent decision-making, the Complete Guide to Azure AI Agents for SMBs explains how to layer intelligence on top of these automation foundations. Azure Logic Apps versus Power Automate for SMB compliance workflows. This is among the most common questions SMBs ask before starting with Azure workflow automation. Both tools share the same underlying connector infrastructure, but they serve different complexity levels and user types. Feature Azure Logic Apps Power Automate. Target user developers and technical SMB teams. Business users, non-technical staff. Pricing model per execution, consumption, or fixed monthly, standard, per user or per flow. Licensing. Complex branching logic. Strong support via code view and inline expressions. Limited works best for linear flows. Long-running workflows supported via stateful workflows. Limited to shorter processes. Azure Service Integration native, tight integration. Moderate via connectors. Best compliance use cases. Multi-system audit trails, data retention, cross-platform logging. Team alerts, single system notifications. Power Automate works well for simple, team-facing compliance alerts. Azure Logic Apps is the better choice when audit integrity, multi-system data retention, and long-running workflow logic are core requirements. For SMBs exploring Power Platform tools broadly, Power Platform, the no-code automation revolution, is a useful starting point for understanding where each tool fits your operations. If your compliance requirements are specifically in financial services, the workflows covered in How to Automate Banking Compliance on Azure apply a similar approach to PCI DSS and banking regulations. Cost and ROI: what SMBs can realistically expect. Azure Logic Apps uses a consumption-based pricing model. As of 2026, the consumption plan charges approximately $0.000025 per action execution. A workflow running 500 actions per day costs roughly 45 cents per month in execution costs, before storage and connector fees. For a small healthcare practice running HIPAA access logging across 50 patient records per day, the total monthly Azure cost for the SMB regulatory automation layer typically stays below $20. The contrast with the alternative is significant. HIPAA violation penalties can reach $50,000 per violation category, and compliance consulting fees for a small practice often run $2,000 to $5,000 per year. Typical efficiency gains SMBs report after implementing compliance automation include: manual compliance reporting, reduced from 8 to 10 hours per week to under 1 hour. Audit preparation, automated report generation replaces several days of manual document gathering. Certification tracking, near zero missed renewals compared to a 15 to 20% miss rate with spreadsheet-based tracking. These gains are not theoretical. They reflect what happens when repetitive, rules-based processes are handled by a system that never forgets a deadline or misreads a date. If managing Azure spend across multiple workloads is a concern, pairing Logic Apps with a broader cost management approach makes sense. The strategies in Azure cost optimization, SMB savings strategies, help keep your Azure bill predictable as your automation footprint grows. Conclusion: regulatory compliance automation for SMBs using Azure Logic Apps removes one of the most persistent drains on small business operations: the time and risk that come with managing compliance manually. Healthcare practices, law firms, logistics companies, and other non-banking SMBs all share the same fundamental need: a reliable system that tracks, documents, alerts, and reports without depending on a person remembering to do it. Azure Logic Apps provides that system at a price point that makes sense for a business with 10 employees, not just 10,000. You do not need a dedicated compliance team or a full-time developer to get started. You need a clear picture of your regulatory requirements and a few hours to build your first workflow. If you are ready to move from manual compliance tracking to automated audit trails, our team can help you design and implement an Azure Logic Apps solution tailored to your industry and your existing Azure environment. Reach out to get started.